And now we leave the book of Genesis behind, which records the story of all of those people that we have looked at up through verse 22. And we come into the book of Exodus, and the book of Exodus tells us the story of Moses.
Start off just reading the book of Exodus without having read or studied the book of Genesis. I think you're going to find yourself a little lost without the background that the book of Genesis gives.
And here we look at the second phase in this sort of four-part transition in Moses' life. This transition from being this sort of prince in Egypt to being a leader of the Exodus. This transition that takes a number of years and that takes a rather winding road.
We think often of Moses as being an old man with a beard, but it was in his youth that he made the decisions that brought him to greatness. Because the scripture says by faith Moses, when he'd come to years, maybe 17 or 18 years of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter.
Welcome to Diggin Deeper, a simple Bible study where we dig deeper into the Word of God. Thank you for joining me. I am your host, Billy Ray Parrish. Today's study will take place in Exodus chapter 14, and we will continue with a complete study. This is something we have only started doing, and I believe these studies, while longer, help us better understand the respective chapter. What is meant by a complete study is not only we'll dig deeper into the chapter with this study, but we will also have other commentaries involved in an effort to get a bigger and deeper understanding of the chapter. A study is fun and can render many great results, but I hope this complete study produces a greater level of understanding. Over the last several chapters, we have been studying the plagues of Egypt brought on by God. And now, the Israelites are preparing to leave Egypt. This was not made possible because of the Israelites, but because of God Almighty. Exodus chapter 14 is made up of 31 verses beginning with verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea, directly opposite Baal-zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." So the Israelites did this. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled Pharaoh, and his officials changed their minds about them, and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go, and have lost their services." So he had his chariot made ready, and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites, who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen, and troops pursued the Israelites, and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth, opposite Baal-zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians, marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, you need only to be still." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water, so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front, and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night the cloud brought darkness to the one side, and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind, and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived, but the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses his servant. Exodus chapter 14 opens with the Lord telling Moses to change direction and camp beside the sea, while warning that Pharaoh would pursue the Israelites. There are different important lessons learned in the first few verses, including the Lord was preparing to perform a mighty act to demonstrate that he is the ruler of all. What we see unfolding is the people had just left Egypt, but God told them to turn back and encamp by the sea. Verse 4 tells us that this is so that God will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host. It's easy to see the direction of the journey changing, but what we do not know, or be certain of, is when God spoke to Moses. That is, if these words came before their departure, or during the journey, but either way, it doesn't change the narrative whichever way it is read and translated. Research reveals that the distance from Egypt to the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula is over 200 miles. Here, we read goes south along the western edge of the Red Sea to a place called Pi Hahiroth, and camp in the face of the mouth of Hahiroth. When we study the names, it appears they have been lost throughout time. And one reason for this may be these were the names given to locations the Israelites knew, but like other sites in the Bible, the names may have later been changed. Regardless, God knew what was happening and knew what he was doing. God knows what's about to come and informs Moses Pharaoh would soon pursue them. Pharaoh does receive word by his outposts of the location of the Israelites, and he also knows their position was unfavorable for them to get away. It appears that the term used here, wilderness, is speaking of the area between the Nile Valley and the Red Sea, but again, God uses this to his advantage. What Pharaoh sees as confusion is actually a trap for his hard heart to eventually succumb to or be swallowed up as a result of. What this illustrates is the events have been orchestrated by the Lord, and Pharaoh's lust and greed are no exception. God makes it clear that Pharaoh would glorify him because of his actions. Clark's commentary explains, without any farther restraining grace, God permits him to rush on to his final ruin, for the cup of his iniquity was now full. For the first time in 8 chapters, Pharaoh is called the king of Egypt. And while he was the leader of Egypt, he was not the king of Israel. Pharaoh's heart hardened as he wondered why he and his servants, let the Israelites go. Matthew Henry is clear that Pharaoh's heart changed toward the Israelites, not the Egyptian people. They who never truly repented of their sins now heartily repent of their only good action. Pharaoh gets together his army and chosen chariots, and they leave. The pulpit commentary explains, the Egyptian monarchs, from the time of the 18th dynasty, always went out to war in a chariot. The chariots were, like the Greek and the Assyrian, open behind, and consisted of a semicircular standing beard of wood, from which rose in a graceful curve the antics, or rim to the height of about 2 feet, and a half above the standing beard. The chariot had 2 wheels and a pole, and was drawn by 2 horses. It ordinarily contained 2 men only, the warrior and the charioteer. Notice that it was not just 600 chariots going after Egypt, but 600 choice chariots, and an unknown number of troop-carrying chariots. This may seem like an insurmountable task for the Israelites to overcome, but it was the Lord that would fight for Israel, and we must remember this in our battles and our troubles today. He is the Redeemer of all. But Pharaoh leaves his post and goes after the Israelites. Not only chariots went to recapture Israel, but the cavalry, and the army followed them, but the strength of the Lord was over Israel. Verse 8 is a reminder that God intervenes on behalf of his people, even when circumstances seem insurmountable. Different times in Exodus, we read about God hardening Pharaoh's heart, which suggests that God allowed Pharaoh's already hardened heart to become even more resolute in its opposition to God's plan. Verse 10 captures the Israelites' moment of fear and desperation when they see Pharaoh's army approaching after fleeing Egypt and becoming trapped by the Red Sea. Verse 11 highlights the Israelites questioning God's intentions and express fear of death. The verse illustrates a turning point from fear to faith in God's promise of salvation. Here, the Israelites reveal a deep-seated fear of death, preferring the chains of slavery over the unknown outcomes of faith. Verse 12 builds on the Israelites' escape from Egypt, where the Israelites' fear and despair are laid bare, but it also sets the stage for God's miraculous intervention. While things do appear dire, Moses encourages the Israelites to trust in God and maintain their faith in the face of fear and danger. Verse 14 was a reminder to the Israelites, and serves as a reminder to us today of God's message to trust in Him, and that we need to give Him all of our worries and let Him fight for us. And further, demonstrates God's power and how He fights for His people. Moses told the people of Israel to stand still, stop. This is often the Lord's direction to the believer in a time of crisis. Verse 15 shows Moses being full of faith before the people. But before God, he cried out in desperate prayer. This was so, as Moses had to show confidence before the nation to encourage their faith. We should always stay with God, stay in prayer. And Moses says as much, asking, "Why do you cry to me?" Charles Spurgeon wrote, "There is a time for praying, but there is also a time for holy activity." Prayer is adapted for almost every season, yet not prayer alone, for there comes, every now and then, a time when even prayer must take a secondary place. Clark's Bible Commentary. Neither Moses nor his rod could be any effective instrument in a work which could be accomplished only by the omnipotence of God. But it was necessary that he should appear in it, in order that he might have credit in the sight of the Israelites, and that they might see that God had chosen him to be the instrument of their deliverance. Verse 16 is a dramatic moment in the Bible where God instructs Moses to part the Red Sea with his staff, allowing the Israelites to escape on dry ground. This instruction was a lesson in faith and obedience, and a demonstration of God's power and sovereignty. God's directive comes with a promise: the waters will part, allowing Israel to cross on dry ground. Verse 17 is broken down by Bible study tools like this: And I, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, that they shall have no sense of danger, and be fearless of it, and cautious and thoughtless, hurried on with wrath, and fury, malice, and revenge, and they shall follow them, the Israelites, into the sea, supposing it to be as safe for the one as the other. And I will give me honor upon Pharaoh, and upon all his host, upon his chariots, and upon his horsemen, by the utter destruction of them, in just retaliation for the many innocent infants that had been drowned by them in the river Nile. Verse 18, God declares to the Egyptians that they will come to know that he is the Lord, as he brings honor upon himself through his mighty acts against Pharaoh and his chariots. Bible Study Tools explains, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, acknowledge him to be Jehovah, the self-existent, eternal, and immutable being, the one only living and true God, who is wise and powerful, faithful, just, and true. That is, those Egyptians that were left behind in Egypt, hearing what was done at the Red Sea, for as for those that came with Pharaoh, they all perished to a man, when I have gotten me honor upon Pharaoh, upon his chariots, and upon his horsemen, by casting them into the sea, and drowning them there, thereby showing himself to be mightier than he. Verse 19 encourages the Israelites to stand firm and trust in God regardless of the odds and obstacles faced, good and bad. It demonstrates the importance of trusting God's guidance, even when it doesn't make sense. Verse 20 explains a miraculous event where God's presence creates a protective barrier between the Israelites and the Egyptian army, and emphasizes God's control over the situation, providing both protection and guidance to his people. Verse 21 illustrates God's miraculous intervention at the Red Sea, demonstrates his care for his people and absolute sovereignty. The Israelites were trapped between Pharaoh's advancing army and the sea, and were about to be destroyed. Verse 23 details the Israelites are crossing the Red Sea when Pharaoh and his army pursue them. Moses stretches out his hand over the sea, dividing the waters and allowing the Israelites to cross safely. When the Egyptians follow, Moses stretches out his hand again, and the sea returns, engulfing the Egyptian army. Verse 24 demonstrates God's love and intervention in the Israelites' escape from Pharaoh's army. Here, God's actions show his deep care for the Israelites and his commitment to protecting them and leading them to freedom. Verse 25 God intervenes to hinder the Egyptian army's pursuit of the Israelites as God makes it difficult for the Egyptians to advance by causing the wheels of their chariots to jam. The Egyptians then flee from the Israelites, saying that the Lord is fighting for them. Verse 27 sees Moses stretching out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal depth at daybreak. Further, Israel's journey toward freedom comes full throttle by establishing a pattern of faith and worship that would echo throughout their history. Verse 28 tells how Lord threw the Egyptians into the sea as they tried to escape. The waters returned and covered the chariots, horsemen, and the entire army of Pharaoh. None of them survived. The verse reveals God's deliverance of the Israelites and judgment of the Egyptians. Verse 29 demonstrates God's love for His people by providing for their safety and well-being. God's act of parting the Red Sea and allowing the Israelites to cross on dry ground is an example of God's intervention to save His people from destruction. Verse 30 is significant as the Israelite people are delivered out of Egypt, which further demonstrates God's love by showing His commitment to the safety and freedom of His people. God's victory over the Egyptian army shows that He cares for His people. Verse 31 describes the Israelites' response after witnessing God's miraculous deliverance of them from the Egyptians at the Red Sea. Clark's Bible commentary explains they were convinced by the interference of Jehovah that His power was unlimited and that He could do whatsoever He pleased, both in the way of judgment and in the way of mercy. They now clearly discerned that God had fulfilled all His promises, and that not one thing had failed of all the good which He had spoken concerning Israel. And they believed His servant Moses. They had now the fullest proof that he was divinely appointed to work all these miracles, and to bring them out of Egypt into the promised land. Think about what we have read in this chapter. The story of God's deliverance of the Israelites from Pharaoh's army is the foundation of the covenant relationship between God and Israel. While the Israelites' fear was a valid emotion, but it could have led them to despair or to God. Exodus chapter 14 verse 14 reminds us to trust in God and to be silent while He fights for us. And as we see with the path of Israel changing their direction, the path to freedom from sin and death can be confusing, but God's leading is still there. Throughout this chapter, we see God protecting and guiding His people, especially in dark times, as God is always present with His people, shielding them from danger and guiding them through the wilderness. God sometimes uses natural phenomena like clouds and darkness to impede His children's enemies. For example, God commanded that the waters part, allowing His people safe passage while bringing destruction to their enemies. Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused a strong wind to blow from the east. The wind blew all night, splitting the sea and drying the ground, while the Egyptians gave chase, pursued the Israelites. The Lord confused the Egyptian army by causing their chariot wheels to swerve. The Egyptians fled, saying, "Let me flee from Israel, for the Lord is fighting for them against the Egyptians." Time and time again, chapter 14 emphasizes the importance of faith, obedience, and trust in divine deliverance. Matthew Henry's concise commentary on Exodus chapter 14 verses 1 through 9. Pharaoh would think that all Israel was entangled in the wilderness, and so would become an easy prey. But God says, "I will be honored upon Pharaoh." All men being made for the honor of their Maker, those whom He is not honored by, He will be honored upon. What seems to tend to the church's ruin is often overruled to the ruin of the church's enemies. While Pharaoh gratified his malice and revenge, he furthered the bringing to pass God's counsels concerning him. Though with the greatest reason he had let Israel go, yet now he was angry with himself for it. God makes the envy and rage of men against His people a torment to themselves. Those who set their faces heavenward and will live godly in Christ Jesus must expect to be set upon by Satan's temptations and terrors. He will not tamely part with any out of His service. From the first few verses, it seems God has set a trap for Pharaoh. Pharaoh agreed to let the Israelites go, but his heart would be hardened as he will pursue them. Verses 10 through 14. There was no way open to Israel but upward, and thence their deliverance came. We may be in the way of duty, following God, and hastening toward heaven, yet may be troubled on every side. Some cried out unto the Lord, their fear led them to pray, and that was well. God brings us into straits, that he may bring us to our knees. Others cried out against Moses, fear set them murmuring, as if God were not still able to work miracles. They quarrel with Moses for bringing them out of Egypt, and so were angry with God for the greatest kindness ever done them. Thus gross are the absurdities of unbelief. Moses says, fear ye not. It is always our duty and interest, when we cannot get out of troubles, yet to get above our fears, let them quicken our prayers and endeavors, but not silence our faith and hope. Stand still, think not to save yourselves either by fighting or flying. Wait God's orders, and observe them. Compose yourselves, by confidence in God, into peaceful thoughts of the great salvation God is about to work for you. If God brings his people into straits, he will find a way to bring them out. Verses 15 through 20. Moses' silent prayers of faith prevailed more with God than Israel's loud outcries of fear. The pillar of cloud and fire came behind them, where they needed a guard, and it was a wall between them and their enemies. The word and providence of God have a black and dark side toward sin and sinners, but a bright and pleasant side toward the people of the Lord. He who divided between light and darkness, Genesis 1 verse 4, allotted darkness to the Egyptians and light to the Israelites. Such a difference there will be between the inheritance of the saints in light and that utter darkness, which will be the portion of hypocrites forever. Verses 21 through 31. The dividing the Red Sea was the terror of the Canaanites. Joshua chapter 2 verse 9. The praise and triumph of the Israelites. Psalm chapter 114 verse 3, chapter 106 verse 9, and chapter 136 verse 13. It was a type of baptism. 1 Corinthians 10 verses 1 and 2. Israel's passage through it was typical of the conversion of souls. Isaiah chapter 11 verse 15. And the Egyptians being drowned in it was typical of the final ruin of all unrepenting sinners. God showed his almighty power by opening a passage through the waters some miles over. God can bring his people through the greatest difficulties and force a way where he does not find it. It was an instance of his wonderful favor to his Israel. They went through the sea, they walked upon dry land in the midst of the sea. This was done in order to encourage God's people in all ages to trust him in the greatest straits. What cannot he do who did this? What will not he do for those that fear and love him, who did this for these murmuring, unbelieving Israelites? Then followed the just and righteous wrath of God upon his and his people's enemies. The ruin of sinners is brought on by their own rage and presumption. They might have let Israel alone, and would not now. They would flee from the face of Israel, and cannot. Men will not be convinced till it is too late that those who meddle with God's people meddle to their own hurt. Moses was ordered to stretch out his hand over the sea. The waters returned and overwhelmed all the host of the Egyptians. Pharaoh and his servants, who had hardened one another in sin, now fell together, not one escaped. The Israelites saw the Egyptians dead upon the sands. The sight very much affected them. While men see God's works and feel the benefit, they fear him and trust in him. How well were it for us if we were always in as good a frame as sometimes. Behold the end to which a Christian may look forward. His enemies rage and are mighty, but while he holds fast by God, he shall pass the ways in safety, guarded by that very power of his Savior, which shall come down on every spiritual foe. The enemies of his soul whom he has seen today, he shall see no more forever. David Platt writes verse 31 is the commentary after God saved his people from the Egyptians not just through the Passover, but through the Red Sea instance when the Egyptians were about to overtake the Israelites. God split that sea in half, sent them through on dry land, and then brought those waters down upon the Egyptians who were pursuing them. Pulpit commentary described verses 1 through 4 as the direction of the journey changed. Hitherto the march of the Israelites had been to the southeast. Another day's journey in this direction would have taken them beyond the limits of Egypt, into the desert region east of the Bitter Lakes, which was dry, treeless, and waterless. In this tract there would have been but scant nourishment for their flocks and herds, and absolutely no water for themselves, unless it had been obtained by miracle. God therefore changed the direction of their route from southeast to due south, and made them take a course by which they placed the Bitter Lakes on their left hand, and so remained within the limits of Egypt in a district fairly well watered, but shut off from the wilderness by the Bitter Lakes, and the northern prolongation of the Gulf of Suez, with which they were connected. This route suited the immediate convenience of the host and, having no suspicion of any hostile movement on the part of the Egyptians, they not unnaturally made no objection to it. It had, however, the disadvantage, in case of a hostile movement, of shutting them in between their assailants on the one hand and the sea upon the other. And this circumstance seems to have led Pharaoh to make his pursuit. Exodus chapter 14 verse 1 verse 2 speak unto the children of Israel that they turn. Kalish translates return, i.e., retrace their steps, and supposes that Etham lay far south of Pi-Hahiroth, on the west coast of the Gulf of Suez, but the Hebrew word means either turn back or turn aside. Dr. Brugge supposes that the turn made was to the north, and the sea reached the Mediterranean. But all other writers, regarding the sea spoken of as the Red Sea, compare with Exodus 13 verse 18, believe the divergence from the previous route to have been towards the south, and place Pi-Hahiroth, Migdol, and Baal-zephon in this quarter. Pi-Hahiroth. The exact position is known. Neither the Egyptian remains nor the writings of the Greeks or Romans present us with any similar geographic name. If Semitic, the word should mean the entrance to the caves, but it is quite possible that it may be Egyptian. Migdol. There was undoubtedly a famous Migdol, or Maktal, on the eastern frontier of Egypt, which was a strong fortified post, and which is often mentioned. Hecataeus called it Magdalos. In the itinerary of Antonine, it is said to be 12 Roman miles from Pelusium, page 76. But this is too northern a position for the Migdol of the present passage, which must represent a tower or fortified post not very remote from the modern Suez, over against Baal-zephon. The accumulation of names, otherwise unknown to the sacred writers, is a strong indication of the familiarity possessed by the author of Exodus with the geography of the country. No late writer could have ventured on such local details. A name resembling Baal-zephon is said to occur in the Egyptian monuments. Dr. Brugge reads it as Baal-zephon. He regards it as the designation of a Phoenician god, and compares Baal-zebub. Others have compared the Zephon with the Greco-Egyptian form Typhon, and have supposed Baal-zephon to be equivalent to Baal-set or Baal Setek, a personification of the principle of evil. Verse 3, they are entangled in the land, or they are confused, perplexed, i.e., they have lost their way. Pharaoh could not conceive that they would have taken the route to the west of the Bitter Lakes, which conducted to no tolerable territory, unless they were hopelessly at sea with respect to the geography of the country. In this perplexity of theirs, he thought he saw his own opportunity. The wilderness has shut them in. Pharaoh is thinking of his own wilderness, the desert country between the Nile Valley and the Red Sea. This desert, he says, blocks their way and shuts them, and they cannot escape if he follows in their steps. For they will have the sea on one hand, the desert on the other, and in their front, while he himself presses upon their rear. Verse 4, I will be honored. See the comment on Exodus 9 verse 16. That the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord. Compare above, chapter 7. Verses 5 through 9, the pursuit of Israel by the Egyptians. A short respite from suffering was sufficient to enable Pharaoh to recover from his extreme alarm. No further deaths had followed on the destruction of the firstborn, and he might think no further danger was to be apprehended. The worst of Moses' threats had been accomplished. Perhaps Jehovah had no more arrows in his quiver. At any rate, as he realized to himself what it would be to lose altogether the services of so vast a body of slaves, many of them highly skilled in different arts, he more and more regretted the permission which he had given. Under these circumstances, intelligence was brought him of the change which the Israelites had made in their route, and the dangerous position into which they had brought themselves. Upon this, he resolved to start in pursuit, with such troops as he could hastily muster. As his chariots were 600, we may presume that his footmen were at least 100,000. All trained and disciplined soldiers, accustomed to warfare. The timid horde of escaped slaves, and used to war, though it might be 5 or 6 times as numerous as his host, was not likely to resist it. Pharaoh no doubt expected an unconditional surrender on the part of the Israelites. As soon as they saw his forces, verse 5, it was told the king of Egypt that the people fled. Pharaoh, when he let the Israelites go, must have felt tolerably certain that they would not voluntarily return. Formally, however, he had only consented to their going a 3 days' journey into the wilderness. From Exodus 12 verse 31. When, being at Etham, on the edge of the wilderness, they did not enter it, but marched southward to Pi-hahiroth. The Egyptians might naturally report that instead of sacrificing, they were flying hasting forwards, placing as much distance as they could between themselves and the Egyptian headquarters. But this report alone would scarcely have moved Pharaoh to action. It was in the accompanying circumstances, in the particular line of route, that he thought to find his opportunity. The people were entangled, verse 3. They might be taken at a disadvantage, and might be reduced to choosing between starvation and a return to Egypt. The heart of Pharaoh, and of his servants, was turned against the people. The reaction of feeling was not confined to Pharaoh. His subjects participated in it. The loss of such a large body of laborers would be generally felt as a severe blow to the prosperity of the nation. It would affect all classes. The poor laborers might be benefited, but the employers of labor are the influential classes, and they would be injured. So Pharaoh's servants were of one mind with their master, and they turned against the Israelites. Why have we done this? In the retrospect, the afflictions which they had suffered did not seem so very great. They at any rate had survived them, and were not perhaps even seriously impoverished. Royal favor will find a way of making up any losses which court minions have suffered out of the general taxation of the country. But in prospect, the loss of 600,000, more or less skilled, laborers appeared a terrible thing. The official class was quite ready to make a strenuous effort to avert the loss. Verse 6, he made ready his chariot. The Egyptian monarchs, from the time of the 18th dynasty, always went out to war in a chariot. The chariots were, like the Greek and the Assyrian, open behind, and consisted of a semicircular standing beard of wood, from which rose in a graceful curve the antics, or rim to the height of about 2 feet, and a half above the standing beard. The chariot had 2 wheels and a pole, and was drawn by 2 horses. It ordinarily contained 2 men only, the warrior and the charioteer. Verse 7, 600 chosen chariots. Diodorus Siculus assigns to one Egyptian king a force of 27,000 chariots, which, however, is probably beyond the truth. But the 1,200 assigned to Shishak, 2 Chronicles 12 verse 3, may well be regarded as historical. And the great kings of the 19th dynasty would possess at least an equal number. The 600 chosen chariots set in motion on this occasion probably constituted a division of the royal bodyguard from Herod. 2:168. The remaining force would be collected from the neighboring cities of northern Egypt as Memphis, Heliopolis, Bubastis, Pithom, and Pelusium. Captains over the whole of them. So the Septuagint, the Vulgate and Syriac version. Some, however, understand warriors in each of them, according to Gesenius, Bottager, Kalish. Verse 8, the children of Israel went out with a high hand, i.e., boldly and confidently, not as fugitives, but as men in the exercise of their just fights, perhaps with a certain amount of ostentation. Verse 9, all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, rather, all the chariot horses. There is no and in the original, his horsemen, rather his riders, or mounted men, i.e., those who rode in the chariots. That the Egyptians had a powerful cavalry at a later date appears from 2 Chronicles chapter 12 verse 3, but the Hebrew text of Exodus, in remarkable accordance with the native monuments of the time, represents the army of this Pharaoh as composed of 2 descriptions of troops, only a chariot and an infantry force. See Hengstenberg, Egyptian und Mose, pages 127 through 129. Overtook them. It is uncertain how long the Israelites remained encamped at Pi-Hahiroth. They would wait so long as the pillar of the cloud did not move. Numbers chapter 9 verses 18, 19, and 20. It must have taken Pharaoh a day to hear of their march from Etham, at least another day to collect his troops, and 3 or 4 days to effect the march from Tanis to Pi-Hahiroth. The Jewish tradition that the Red Sea was crossed on the night of the 21st of Nisan, or Abib, is therefore conceivably a true one. Verses 10 through 14. The terror of Israel and the courage of Moses. It has been argued that the Israelites, if they were so numerous as stated from Exodus chapter 12 verse 37, must have been wretched cowards. If they were afraid to risk an engagement with such an army as that hastily levied one which Pharaoh had brought with him. But the difference between an army of trained soldiers, thoroughly equipped for war, with helmets, shields, breastplates, swords, and spears, and an undisciplined multitude, unarmed for the most part, and wholly unaccustomed to warfare, is such that the latter, whatever its numbers, may be excused if it does not feel able to cope with the former, and declines an engagement. Numbers, without military training and discipline, are of no avail, nay, are even a disadvantage, since the men impede one another. It is not necessary to suppose that the Israelites were debased in character by their long servitude to account for their panic on seeing the army of Pharaoh. They had good grounds for their fear. Humanly speaking, resistance would simply have led to their indiscriminate massacre. The alarm of the Hebrews, and even the reproaches with which they assail Moses, are thus quite natural under the circumstances. What is surprising is the noble courage and confidence of Moses. Moses, though only vaguely informed that God would be honored upon Pharaoh and all his host, check verse 4, is perfectly certain that all will go well. How the result will be achieved, he knows not. But he is sure that Israel will be delivered. And Egypt discomfited, his people have no reason to fear, they have but to stand still and see the salvation of God. From verse 13, the Lord will fight for them, they will have simply to hold their peace. From verse 14, verse 10, they were sore afraid. Before the Israelites are taxed with cowardice, let it be considered one, that they were unarmed. Egypt was so settled a government that civilians generally went unarmed. And slaves, like the Hebrews, would scarcely have been allowed to possess any arms, if the case had been otherwise. 2. They had no military training. Whatever had been done to teach them order and arrangement in connection with their proposed journey, we may be sure there had been no drill or training in the use of arms, since this would have been regarded by the Egyptians as open rebellion. 3. They were quite unaccustomed to warfare. The Pharaoh's maintained large garrisons of Egyptian and mercenary troops in the frontier provinces to resist the invasions to which they were liable. The Hebrews may have had occasionally to defend themselves against a hasty raid, but in real war they had stood aloof and left the fighting to the regular Egyptian army. The children of Israel cried out unto the Lord. The appeal to Jehovah showed that, with all their weaknesses and imperfections, the Israelites were yet true at heart. They knew where alone help was to be obtained, and made their appeal accordingly. No cry is more sure of an answer than the despairing one, Lord, save us, we perish. Verse 11, and they said to Moses. It was not unnatural that, while flying to God as their only refuge, they should be angry with Moses. Moses, they would argue, ought to have known better than to have brought them into a situation of such peril. He, the leader, should have known the geography of the country. He, the courtier, should have known the temper of the court. It is always a satisfaction to men to vent their anger upon someone when they are in a difficulty. No graves in Egypt. Egypt, with a necropolis outside every city, was a land of tombs. Surely they might have found graves there, instead of being led out to such a distance simply to die. Verse 12, is not this the word that we did tell thee? The reference was probably to that time of depression, after their burdens had been increased, and before the series of miracles began, when the Israelites had addressed reproaches to Moses and Aaron, from Exodus 5 verse 21, and refused to listen to words of encouragement, from Exodus 6 verse 9. It was not true that they had uniformly held the same language, and desired Moses and Aaron to cease their efforts. It had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die. The spirit to prefer death to slavery, where they are the only alternatives, is not a common one, and we must not be surprised that a people which had grown up in servitude and had no traditions of national independence did not rise to the heroic height attained under other circumstances by Greeks, by Switzers, and by Poles. It would have been most extraordinary had they done so. Verse 13, and Moses said, Fear ye not. Moses knew that the pursuit of Israel by the host of the Egyptians was a part of the counsel of God, and was to tend in some way or other to the promotion of God's honor and glory. Verse 4. He had sufficient faith to believe in a deliverance the nature of which it is not likely that he could anyway conjecture, whether hail would fall from heaven and destroy them, from Joshua 10 verse 11, or the earth gape and swallow them up, from Numbers 16:32, or the angel of death smite them all in the night, 2 Kings 19 verse 35, or any other strange form of destruction come upon them. He did not know, but he concluded from what had been revealed to him, that God was about to vindicate his own honor without the aid of man. Hence his word stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord, which assigned to the Israelites a mere passive attitude of expectation. For the Egyptians, etc., the order of the words in the original favors the marginal rendering, which is to be adopted with one slight change. Translate: for, as ye have seen the Egyptians today, ye shall see them again no more forever. I.e., ye shall see them no more alive, vigorous and menacing, but still and lifeless upon the Red Sea shore. Verse 30. There is no reference to any other Egyptians than those with Pharaoh in the camp, nor to any later relations between Egypt and the chosen people. Verse 14. Ye shall hold your peace, i.e., do nothing, remain at rest. Verses 15 through 18. God's answer to Moses' prayer. To the faithful prayer of Moses, albeit pitched perhaps in too low a key, God made gracious answer. Inquiry had been unnecessary, since his word was already pledged to bring his people safe to Canaan, and to get himself honor upon Pharaoh in connection with the pursuit from verse 4. But, as the appeal has been made, he responds with a plain statement of what is now to be done. 1. The Israelites are to make themselves ready for a forward movement. Verse 15:2. Moses is to stretch out his rod over the Red Sea, and it will be divided. 3. The Israelites are then to make the passage on dry ground. 4. The Egyptians are to follow, and then honor is to be gotten upon them, and they are to know by the result that God is indeed Jehovah. Verses 15 and 16. Wherefore criest thou to me? It is evident that Moses, while boldly encouraging the people, himself needed the support and consolation of prayer. The Syriac translator shows us that he divined the fact aright. When he without authority intruded the words, Moses then cried to Jehovah. The form of the divine reply to his prayer seems to indicate a certain amount of reproach, as if Moses himself had become unduly anxious. Speak unto the children of Israel that they go forward. The Israelites were not to rest in their encampment, but to form in line of march, and descend to the very shore of the sea, and there hold themselves in readiness. Moses was to lift up his rod, the rod with which his other miracles had been wrought, and stretch out his hand over the sea, and then the drying up was to begin. Thus was most of the night passed. Verse 17. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians. Here, and here only, are the hearts of the Egyptians generally said to have been hardened. Whatever meaning we attach to the expression, there will be no more difficulty in applying it to them than to Pharaoh. They had made themselves partakers in the monarch's guilt by mustering in hot haste when he summoned them, and had allowed themselves to revel in the anticipation of plunder and carnage, from Exodus 15 verse 9. Under such circumstances, the general laws which govern human nature would be quite sufficient to make their hearts grow hard. They shall follow them. Upon this act rash, if the phenomenon had been a mere natural one, presumptuous and infatuated, if the drying up were regarded as miraculous, depended altogether the destruction of the Egyptians, they had only to have stood still and allowed the escape which a week previously they had done their best to encourage, in order to have remained safe and unhurt. It was their stupidity and bloodthirstiness which alone brought them into any danger. Upon his horsemen, rather his chariot men. Verse 18. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. All Egypt would learn the destruction of the host, and the circumstances under which it occurred, whose miraculous nature could not be concealed. And the consequence would be a wide recognition of the superior might of Jehovah, the God of Israel, over that of any of the Egyptian deities. More than this, the Egyptians were not likely to admit under any circumstances. Verses 19 through 22. The passage of the Red Sea. The Egyptians had arrived in the near neighborhood of the Israelite camp, at the close of a long day's march towards evening. Having ascertained that the fugitives were still, as they had expected them to be, shut in between the sea and the wilderness, they were content, and made no immediate attack, but encamped over against them. Hereupon the pillar of the cloud, which was at the time in front of the Israelite camp, probably near the point where God intended the passage of the sea to be effected, removed from this position, and placed itself directly behind the Israelite encampment, between them and the Egyptians. This movement alone was calculated to alarm the latter, and prevent them from stirring till near daybreak, but, the better to secure their inaction, the pillar was made to overshadow them with a deep and preternatural darkness, so that it became almost impossible for them to advance. Meanwhile, on the side which was turned towards the Israelites, the pillar presented the appearance of a bright flame, lighting up the whole encampment, and rendering it as easy to make ready for the march as it would have been by day. Thus, the beasts were collected and laid in the columns marshaled, and prepared to proceed in a certain fixed order, and everything made ready for starting so soon as the bed of the sea should be sufficiently dry. Moses, about nightfall, descending to the water's edge, stretched forth his rod over the waves, and an east wind at once springing up, accompanied perhaps by a strong ebb of the tide, the waters of the Gulf were parted in the vicinity of the modern Suez, and a dry space left between the bitter lakes, which were then a prolongation of the Gulf, and the present sea bed. The space may have been one of considerable width. The Israelites, entering upon it, perhaps about midnight, accomplished the distance, which may not have exceeded a mile, with all their belongings, in the course of 5 or 6 hours, the pillar of the cloud withdrawing itself, as the last Israelites entered the sea bed, and retiring after them like a rear guard. Thus protected, they made the transit in safety, and morning saw them encamped upon the shores of Asia. Verse 19. The angel of God. The divine presence, which manifested itself in the pillar of the cloud, is called indifferently the Lord. See Exodus 13 verse 21, Exodus 14 verse 24. And the angel of God, just as the appearance to Moses in the burning bush is termed both God and the angel of the Lord, from Exodus 3 verse 2, which went before, i.e., which ordinarily, and so to speak habitually preceded the camp. See Exodus 13 verse 21, and Psalm 78 verse 14, and stood behind them, took up a fixed station for the night, or the greater portion of it. Verse 20. It was a cloud and darkness to them, but it gave light by night to these. Though there is nothing in the Hebrew correspondent to the expressions to them, to these, yet the meaning seems to have been rightly apprehended by our translators. See the Targums of Onkelos and Jonathan, the Syriac version. And among moderns, Noble, Maurer, Rosenmuller, and Kalish. Verse 2. Moses stretched out his hand, as commanded by God, from verse 16. Compare the somewhat similar action of Elijah and Elisha when they divided the Jordan, according to 2 Kings chapter 2 verses 8 and 14. The Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind. The Septuagint translate a strong south wind, but the Hebrew Kaddim is certainly east rather than south. It is not, however, east in the sense of due east, but would include all the range of the compass between northeast and southeast. If we suppose the bitter lakes to have been joined to the Red Sea by a narrow and shallow channel, the action of a southeast wind, by driving the water of the lakes northward, may have easily produced the effect described in the text. A simultaneous ebb of the lower Gulf would have further facilitated the passage. The waters were divided. Water remained in the upper extremity of the Gulf, now the site of the bitter lakes, and also, of course, below Suez. The portion of the sea dried up lay probably between the present southern extremity of the Bitter Lakes and Suez. By the gradual elevation and desiccation of the region, it has passed into permanent dry land. Verse 22. The waters were a wall, i.e., a protection, a defense. Pharaoh could not attack them on either flank, on account of the two bodies of water between which their march lay. He could only come at them by following after them. The metaphor has been by some understood literally, especially on account of the expression in Exodus 15 verse 8, the floods stood upright as an heap, and again that in Psalm 78 verse 13, he made the waters to stand as an heap. But those phrases, occurring in poems, must be taken as poetical, and can scarcely have any weight in determining the meaning of wall here. We must ask ourselves, is there not an economy and a restraint in the exertion by God even of miraculous power? Is more used than is needed for the occasion? And would not all that was needed at this time have been effected by such a division of the sea as we have supposed, without the fluid being converted into a solid, or having otherwise the laws of its being entirely altered? Kalish's statement that the word wall here is not intended to convey the idea of protection, but only of hardness and solidity, seems to us the very reverse of the truth. Protection is at any rate the main idea, and any other is secondary and subordinate. Verses 23 through 31. The destruction of the Egyptians. As the regard of the Israelite host, having entered the tract from which the waters had retired, proceeded along it, and left the western end of the isthmus vacant. The pillar of the cloud seems to have followed it up, and withdrawn with it. The Egyptians immediately advanced. Notwithstanding the preternatural darkness, they had become aware, perhaps by means of their ears, of the movement that was taking place, and with early dawn they were under arms, and pressing on the line of the Israelite retreat. They found the channel still dry, and hastily entering it with their chariot force, they hurried forward in pursuit. The first check which they received was wholly supernatural. The Lord looked unto the host of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and of the cloud, and troubled the host of the Egyptians. Verse 24. Details here are wanting, but less cannot be meant than that some strange phenomena connected with the retiring pillar caused a panic, and threw the ranks of the army into confusion. Then followed natural impediments. The Lord took off, or clogged their chariot wheels, and made them go heavily, i.e., the chariot wheels, not by miracle, but by the operation of God's natural laws, sank into the soft sand over which the Israelites had passed easily, having no wheeled vehicles, and the chariots were consequently dragged forward slowly and with difficulty. The double hindrance from the confusion and the stoppage of the chariots so discouraged the Egyptians that after a time they resolved on beating a retreat. Verse 25. They had set out on their return, when Moses, at God's instance, stretched forth his hand once more over the sea, and the waters on both sides began at once to return. The Egyptians saw their danger, and fled against the advancing tide, racing against it, as it were, and seeking to reach the shore, but in vain. The waves came on rapidly, and, in the language of verse 28, there was not a man of all those who had entered the dry bed of the sea that was not overwhelmed and drowned in the waters. We should be wrong to press this language to the extreme letter. In graphic narrative, the sacred writers uniformly employ universal expressions, where they mean to give the general fact or general result. The true meaning is that the pursuit altogether failed. Not an Egyptian made his way alive across the strait. All that the Israelites ever saw afterwards of the army that they had so much dreaded, verse 10, was a ghastly mass of corpses thrown up by the tide on the Asiatic shore. Verse 30. Verse 23. All Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. Here, as elsewhere, the word translated horsemen probably means the men who rode in the chariots. Observe that the Pharaoh himself is not said to have gone in. Manetho was apt to avoid placing himself in a position of danger. According to Records of the Past, Volume 4, pages 44 and 45. Nor is any of the infantry said to have entered the bed of the sea. Verse 24 in the morning watch. The morning watch of the Hebrews at this period of their history lasted from 2 a.m. to sunrise. Sunrise in Egypt, early in April, would take place about 5:45. The Lord looked unto the host of the Egyptians. The description in Psalm chapter 77 verses 17 and 18 is generally regarded as belonging to this point in the narrative of the Exodus, and may be considered as the traditional exposition of it. The clouds poured out water. The skies sent out a sound. 9 arrows also went abroad the voice of. Thy thunder was in the heavens, the lightning lightened the world, the earth trembled and shook. As Josephus says, showers of rain came down from the sky, and dreadful thunders. And lightning, with flashes of fire, thunderbolts also were darted upon them, nor was there anything wont to be sent by God upon men as indications of his wrath, which did not happen upon this occasion, and troubled the host, or disturbed the host, i.e., threw it into confusion. Verse 25, and took off their chariot wheels. The Septuagint has clogged the axles of their chariots. But this is from a reading not at present found in the Hebrew manuscripts. Most modern commentators, however, prefer the reading which gives a. Verses 26 and 27, and the Lord said. God here interposed a new difficulty. Moses was instructed to stretch out his rod once more, and undo his former work. At the appointed sign, the east wind ceased to blow, and the waters of the bitter lakes, no longer driven to the northwest by its force, flowed back with something of a reflux, while at the same time, the tide having turned, the Red Sea waves came rushing on at unwonted speed. In vain the Egyptians fled. They were met by the advancing floods, which poured in on either side, overwhelming, and covering up all those who had entered on the dangerous path. Verse 28, the chariots and the horsemen, and all the host of Pharaoh. Rather the chariots, and the chariot men of all the host of Pharaoh. So noble correctly. Kalish thinks we are not permitted to suppose that only the Egyptian chariots pursued the Israelites into the sea, while the infantry remained behind, so that the former alone were devoured by the waves. But even he admits that both in this and in the following chapter, and in most other parts generally, the destruction of the chariots, perhaps chariot force, and its warriors is chiefly alluded to, so that this particular stress would perhaps justify that conclusion. What is clear is that no force, but the chariot force is said to have entered the bed of the sea in pursuit of Israel. There remained not so much as one of them. On the proper understanding of this statement, see the introductory paragraph to the chapter. Verse 29, walked. Rather, had walked. The waters were a wall. Rather, had been a wall. For the meaning of the expression, see note on verse 22. Verse 30, Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. Josephus says that, after the passage of the sea by the Israelites, a west wind set in, which, assisted by the current, drove the bodies of the drowned Egyptians to the eastern side of the Gulf, where many of them were cast up upon the shore. In this way Moses, according to him, obtained weapons and armor for a considerable number of Israelites. Verse 31, and Israel saw that great work. The work was, at the least, 1. the almost entire destruction of that arm of the service, the chariot force on which the Egyptian kings mainly relied for success in all their wars, and 2. The defeat and disgrace of the Egyptian king himself, in an expedition for which he was alone responsible, involving permanent discredit to his military capacity, and naturally tending to shake his authority over his subjects. It secured the Israelites from further persecution, mainly by the reminiscences which it left behind, but partly also by removing them to a distance from the natural course of Egyptian warlike or commercial movement. Though Egypt had mining establishments in the Sinaitic Peninsula, at Wadi Megara and Sarabit el-Kadhim, yet as these were avoided by the Israelites on their way to Sinai, and never afterwards approached, there naturally was no collision between them and the pharaonic garrisons at those sites. Still more remote were they during their wanderings from the Egyptian military route, which proceeded along the coast from Pelusium to Gaza, and then ran northwards through the Shephelah. Thus the passage of the Red Sea brought one phase in the life of the people to an end, and was the commencement of another. It separated them from Egypt until the time came when their king would hold communication with its monarch on equal terms. 1 Kings chapter 3 verse 1. It secured their independence and raised them at once into a nation. It further caused them to exchange the artificial life of a bureaucratical and convention-loving community for the open space and untrammeled freedom of the desert. It thus rejuvenated and reinvigorated the race, and enabled them to enter on that career of conquest which culminated in the kingdom, may we not say the empire, of David. Some writers have supposed that the blow to the Egyptian power was greater than here represented. They believe the entire warrior caste or class to have taken part in the expedition, and to have been destroyed in the Red Sea. Thus, they describe the calamity as the total annihilation of the whole military force of the Egyptians from Kailash. They also believe the Pharaoh to have perished with his host. To the present writer it seems that the former opinion is contrary both to the text of Scripture and to the after course of Egyptian history. For it is agreed on all hands that Egypt continued nearly as powerful as before, while the latter he regards as at least exceedingly doubtful. Psalm 86 verse 15 is quoted as asserting it. But it appears to him, 1, that overthrow is not necessarily death, and 2, that Pharaoh and his host may be put for Pharaoh's host by Hendiadys. The absence of any prophecy that God would take the Pharaoh's life, and the entire silence of Moses on the subject in chapters 14 and 15 seems to be scarcely explicable on any other theory than that he escaped, not having accompanied his chariot force in its rash pursuit of the Israelites. We have reached the end of our Bible study today for Exodus chapter 14. We have experienced many firsts and historical events in the book of Genesis. And now, we are beginning a new history for the Israelite people, including the turning of Pharaoh against the Jewish people, the death order, and the arrival of Moses, and God's instructions for Moses to lead the Jewish people out of slavery. But Pharaoh will not be convinced so easily. The last several chapters have illustrated the significance and destruction of the plagues upon Egypt, and now we have arrived at the last plague, and the Passover of the Israelites, and now the Exodus out of Egypt. If you liked what you just watched, if you would, think about subscribing to our channel. Once again, I am your host, Billy Ray Parrish, and until next time, thank you for joining us. Stay safe and God bless.